studied architecture and engineering at UT Austin. And then I jumped right into doing some energy modeling and daylight modeling with positive energy. I'm also really passionate about communication. And so I try to make graphics that are visually representative and communicate them clearly verbally as well.
Love it. And I'm Miguel. I've been with Positive Energy for about 8 years, I think it's been now. Before this, in another life, I worked in the tech sector, hated that, not my game. I'm a trained archaeologist. That's actually how I kind of got into buildings, which is a bit of an odd path. But that's what happened. And I also was was sort of a carpenter's assistant for this union gig for Bill Graham Presents in San Francisco before C3 bought them out, and that was a lot of fun. So if you ever want to chat carpentry specific to stage pieces for names such as Bob Dylan, Train, Dave Matthews Band, we can chat about those at another time. We're super excited to be here tonight. Kate and I have been kind of scheming on how we could talk about a subject that's really important, and that's really making Passive House accessible, like showing people how far they are from Passive House. I think a lot of people, it's not as though the building industry or even the design industry goes into every single day with this, poor ethos and bad work effort. It's a lot of diligence and hard work and exertion, and it's really just a lack of knowledge. We have so much technology, we have so many really powerful minds working on stuff, and it's coalescing that in a way that that really it focuses on the outcome. And that's what I appreciate about Passive House Accelerator, is that it's making resources like this available to folks who want to learn and who want to dig in deeper. So what we're calling this is breaking the norm. And what we're going to focus on is how Positive Energy has engaged in making Passive House possible in markets where it's not normal, where it's an unknown entity and it can feel super scary. So we're going to dive into how we do that. Let me make sure I can actually change slides here. All right, Kate, you want to walk them through the outline?
Sure. So we've got 3 case studies to walk you through, and for each we'll talk about the context, the big question that popped up during our communication with them, our collaboration, and then also talk about what we came up with, what challenges we addressed, and what outcomes we rose.
So we were trying to think of how we could slice this in a way that could be more broadly applicable. Historically, Positive Energy has built its reputation on being building science consultants, but also doing MEP for really high-end homes. We've always had a deep passion for Passive House and have been working really hard to move it into the market here in Texas, as well as other hot, humid climates. But historically, it was just difficult to make that a business model because there wasn't a lot of demand. But we're very, very passionate about the work that we do. And so we saw a clear need for a deep level of MEP coordination and building science consulting for high-end homes. And over time, we've tried to position ourselves so that we can make our services available for projects at different scales and of different budgets. And so a neat way for us to kind of explore how we've done that is to focus on these 3 different projects, 3 different scales, 3 very different budgets, 3 very different programs, all Passive House projects, and all projects where, luckily for us, the owner was super interested in making this possible. So that's kind of key factor number 1 to start working into your mind, is that there are owners who are aware of this stuff, and programs like this really matter in educating owners on what is possible. So the first project that you see on the top left is a house that any of us would live in, right? A normal family wants to build a high performance home. The owner works at a university in Fayetteville, Arkansas, and essentially wanted to try this out as a test case to see if he could become a Passive House builder. So there's a lot of learning to do. Found an architect, but the architect had never done a Passive House, was a little unsure about where it was going to go, how it was going to work. The house you see in the middle a super high-end luxury residence on Lake Austin here in Central Texas, which if you've never been out there, it's lovely, it's beautiful. We do a lot of work out there. And it's actually a fun little factoid. At least last month, I checked, a square foot of real estate on the lake in Austin was as much, if not more expensive than the same square foot of real estate on a Malibu beach property. So there's that. Austin's a totally insane place when it comes to construction right now. But this project was really neat. It was an architect with whom we'd already worked on several projects, was well known for kind of neighborhood appropriate and contextual architecture, does a really wonderful job at not overdoing the architectural expression on the interior and really just bringing you into this beautiful space on the interior. Had never done a passive house, was curious about it. The owner was all in, wanted to really explore every potential aspect of this, had a lot of interest in resiliency, and just wanted to see what was possible. And so that's why we were involved. And then the last one that you see is a hotel, and it's sort of a cross between a hotel and multifamily project on Galveston Island, just southeast of Houston. And it's obviously a very extreme marine climate, a lot of challenges there, and nobody had heard of Passive House on Galveston before. So it was an owner who kind of came from a family that did a lot of development in Houston, and was interested in really seeing, like, he's all in. He wants to do Passive House projects and wants to show what that can feel like, right? And so he's talking about making impacts to big development portfolios out beyond just this project. So yeah, that's sort of the shake of it. Kate, did I leave anything out? Anything you want to add?
One thing that I think is really cool about at least, well, no, I'd say all of these projects is that all of the owners were really interested in sort of making their projects an example for Passive House. They all want to bring other people there and kind of show off the importance of it and what it means to the general public, which is really special.
Absolutely. So that's sort of thread number 2 to start tracking here, is this notion that, or so first of all, the owner is interested, and second of all, these are sort of like hands-on case studies for the local market, and that's a really big deal where Passive House is not normal. So start internalizing that and think about where you interface with Passive House projects in your market. Okay, so how did we help? What did we do? We had to break the typical architectural design process. Typically, when we would engage for MEP services on projects, for example, we're often getting brought in at mid to late DD, frankly. They're on the downhill slope to construction documents. And if we're talking about pulling big levers that have everything to do with architecture and very little to do with the systems that are later specified, that's where Positive Energy wanted to make impact. And so we said, how do we do that? We want to front load our thinking. This is the McLeamy curve. If you've ever seen that before, Patrick McLeamy at HOK came up with this idea. It's sort of Christoph always uses the 4 E's, I think, everyone engaging everything early. That's a nice little catchy phrase that you can think about. But we were trying to process how we could do this, right? How to leverage the expertise that we have at Positive Energy and even bring new value, new services to the market. And Kate has been absolutely instrumental in building that side of our business with these 3 kind of ontological groupings of consulting that we do. And I'm going to let Kate kind of talk through those for you.
So we've divided up performance consulting, which is what we call the early phase of design, into 3 different categories. And this first one is passive. So while the architecture is still relatively malleable, we like to go in and give the architect and their team a gut check to see how well the windows are placed, where the radiation's coming in, if there's going to be too much light in any given space. That also directly usually translates to too much heat in any given space. So it's really helpful for us to help architects understand where those problem points could be before they show their design to a client and the client falls in love with it. Next, we like to talk about mechanical systems. So always our ultimate goal with mechanical systems is to create superior indoor air quality and deliver heating and cooling. But the biggest barrier that we've seen in the engineering design phase is that we don't have a lot of space. And so in the active system portion of our scope, we tend to look at the plans and see where mechanical systems could go, where they make the most sense, and then also point out any areas of potential challenges and concerns for ductwork to pass through. In the resilient systems portions of things, this has to do with something that we are now thinking about on a weekly basis here in Texas summer, which is losing power. Sorry, I don't know if you guys can hear my dog, but she's needing some attention. So we look at solar generation and also with storage capacity and see how well we can meet the needs of a house during a power outage. And sometimes we look at generators as well. It's hard to get away from that in the Texas climate, unfortunately. And then the last thing we tend to look at is rainwater collection. So we'll look at how much rainwater could be collected off the roof, where it would store, that sort of thing, and also space allocation for all of those concepts as well.
Yeah, and just briefly to touch a little bit more on each one of those, when we get into the passive systems analysis, it's one of those situations where often we'll walk into a project where an architecture firm is, we're talking to them about wanting to model their daylighting, model glare, model, daylight autonomy, model for overlit and underlit spaces and shading. And they're like, no, we've got daylight, right? This is what we do. Our instincts are great. And we're like, yeah, we absolutely believe that your instincts are great, and we want to check it, right? It's like there's this, there can often be a magical switch of confidence that's turned on whenever a computer does things. And we have worked with these computers to make sure that they give lots of really good information. And we've had comments from architecture firms after we go through this process, like, wow, I really thought I knew daylighting, and now I feel like I even understand it better, and I'm better equipped to start moving forward through these through this sort of analysis in my own firm, even without positive energy, which is great. Like, we don't need to touch every single project an architecture firm does with the service. We want to get in. It may take a few projects working together, but they can learn a lot, right? With active systems, as Kate said, space is so important. And it's also really helpful, even if we're not going to go through with a full engineering scope, just to have some engineering expertise applied to creating a system concept, right? Not just leaving it to whatever the installers are incentivized to use based on what they can get at their supply house or what they get, a nice kickback for. It really is based on this specific project. It's all about setting up that project for success. And of course, getting feedback from installers is so important. We're not just the kind of firm that's going to hand down an edict and say, good luck. It's not a baton handoff, it's a collaborative process. And so understanding what the market can bear is really important as well when you're thinking about these emerging markets for passive house. And then with resilient, like, this is the second time in 3 days that the public, or that the energy utility in Texas has said, we really need you to conserve power. We don't think we're going to have enough supply today. That's a reality here. It's also, we've had water boil notices, like more in the last, I think, 5 years than we've ever had in the history of Austin, Texas. And water and energy grid relationships are changing across the country. And so we're hearing from projects more and more like, hey, I want to sort this out, whether my goal is resiliency for my own family's sake, kind of that mentality, or whether it's, yeah, this is the right thing to do, or whether it's like, yeah, I mean, this is an investment that I'm going to sell later, and this is what people are going to want. Making sure that there is a plan in place for that is really important. And that's what we get into there. So enough about this. Let's talk about the projects. So Kate, you want to describe this first project for us? Just give us some context about what was going on with it.
Sure. So this is a smaller single family home in Fayetteville. And as we mentioned before, this was the most budget constrained project. This is not a multi-million-dollar house with lots of money to throw around. We were sort of doing what was within the realm of possibility for the owner. And this will absolutely be one of the first passive houses in Arkansas, which is why the owner is really excited about making it an educational component as well. He works closely with the university right now and is interested in bringing some architecture and engineering students in to check it out and see what's going on. The architecture team also didn't have a lot of familiarity with Passive House. And so they brought us in at the earliest level that we do, which is that daylight and energy analysis, to look at how well the house is doing, and if it's sort of in the striking range of what Passive House would need to be.
Yeah, and it's also the case that the owner of this project is one of the sweetest human beings I've ever met. If he's on this call, I don't know if he is, but if he is, hi, it's good to see you. We in our outline, we were kind of framing this with what's the big question, right? And so the big question for this project, he said, well, okay, what is the most economical way and best way I can connect positive energy with my architecture team to understand how close I am to Passive House? I want to get in striking range. And so passive systems analysis, that daylight and thermal comfort modeling, and kind of a broad look at his enclosure strategy was where we landed. And so briefly, you can see just kind of a smattering of some of the graphics from this analysis that we do. And giving feedback at this early phase was so important, and we'll illustrate why. So Kate, why don't you talk a little bit about the window to wall ratio kind of outputs that we learned about this project and what that meant for them?
Sure. So this project decided to go with a Passive House prescriptive method, which meant that they needed a window to wall ratio of less than 18%. And with our analyses, we actually discovered that they were being really conservative and had actually overcorrected for the amount of glazing that they needed. And so they were actually able to add more. And that's a really exciting thing that we get to say. I think this is the only time this has ever happened, that they got more glazing based on our analysis. Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty fantastic. And just to clarify for everybody, all three of these projects that we're talking about are FIAS projects, not PHI. So as you can just kind of like piggyback on what Kate was describing here, this is a point in time illuminance study and just kind of some snapshots from that. And so what we actually do is when we go through this analysis, we'll build our model, run our scripts, and start finding interesting observations that we want to document for the project team. And that's sort of the feedback round that we want to do with them in charrette. And so not only will we show them these really great graphics and they get a nice memorandum of this, but we will also fly through the model with them in real time. We can look at the dining room table at Thanksgiving, right? When they're big Thanksgiving family, they want to have everybody over. What is it going to look like? Is it a glary spot? Is it too dark? And you can see like there were some significant underlit spaces here, which if you're even trying to go with the prescriptive route for FIAS, you've got some wiggle room to increase some of that glazing and actually improve the visual comfort without hitting that threshold of negative thermal performance. And that was awesome because it showed the architect, like one of the biggest criticisms that we'll always get when we're talking to somebody new about Passive House is like, well, that's gonna keep me from being able to daylight my spaces the right way. They assume that we're trying to build a Yeti with no windows whatsoever, and it's like, no, you can't. It's artificial to think of architectural design and the daylighting component of that and the thermal performance of the design as mutually exclusive. They are the same thing, and they have a very interesting and unique relationship that needs to be considered and needs to be evaluated quantitatively. And so that's what we were doing in this part of it. And we also took a look at the enclosure strategies that they had, and kind of as they have designed those enclosures versus kind of some benchmarks of Passive House, and then Passive House with some advanced shading strategies. Oh, real quick, before I dive into that, Kate, did you want to say anything about this slide? I'm sorry if I blasted ahead.
No, you're good. Yeah, I'll add one thing, which is that and from my perspective, when we do, as Miguel was talking about, flying around the model, looking at a table on Thanksgiving evening, it really brings the clients and the architects into the work that we're doing, and it gets them really excited about looking at these analyses. It takes an architect from thinking, oh, I know how to do daylighting, like all of my windows are perfect, to, hey, like, here's here's a really big red spot. And you're not seeing a lot of that here. You're seeing the opposite, which is what we worked on to help them. Go ahead.
All right, so back to this. This kind of illustrates the really interesting dynamic at play here, where because Fayetteville's climate is pretty mixed across the seasons, you see in cooling mode, or in the cooling degree days rather, passive house level enclosure with shading does phenomenally well to keep that space incredibly cool, very stable, very comfortable. That HVAC system is just going to have to barely sip energy to keep that space nice and cool, even on super hot days. Whereas if you look at the heating degree days, that shading starts to bounce against them a little bit, right? So it's not allowing some of that passive thermal gain that you get through the windows that they do have. And so helping architects contextualize this through different strategies of external shading, like thinking about how they might make it operable on a seasonal basis and that kind of thing. It's a really fun place to explore. And Kate has done a wonderful job of actually building a lot of architectural precedents that we'll talk through with different firms when we go through this process, so they can see, like, we're not just proposing this abstract thing, we're actually bringing it to design thinking from an aesthetic perspective as well, which matters a lot, right? These people are spending a lot of money to hire an architect to bring this project to life. They want it to look beautiful, they want it to perform beautifully, and we want to help them connect those dots. So this was how we answered the big question for this project, was getting them in striking range. And of course, they already had on their end the CPHC aspect of things figured out. They went through that WUFI model on their own as they started to kind of break away from the prescriptive path to understand what they could play around with a little more. So that was a really special kind of handoff moment for us to say, like, you're in great shape, and you've actually got some wiggle room here. They felt pretty confident and are moving forward with that project.
One more thing I'll add here is that you can tell that the form factor of the building was already set in stone when we did this analysis. And that means that the main things that we worked on were looking at the different envelope upgrades that they could make in the shading. And so that's kind of what we're looking at here. And even though the architecture was pretty much already set in stone, we were still able to make an impact in this way.
Absolutely. And that's a nice segue into this next one, where when we got involved with the project, it was a glimmer in someone's eye. It had barely been conceived of when we got involved. And that was really great, because it was an owner who has plenty of money and wanted to really kind of throw everything but the kitchen sink at it to figure out how they could make this the best house they could be. And the big question for them was, how do we reconcile, the fine architectural detail that the firm that we're working with demands with my robust performance criteria? And that's why they engaged us. We have a lot of experience in both the high performance and high end space, and so it was a natural fit. The owner wasn't, he was not particularly interested in achieving passive house certification. Like, that wasn't a hard and fast criteria. And I think a lot of that in early conversations was driven by the fact that the architecture firm had never done a passive house. And so it wasn't like they were sort of relying on us to navigate this communication with the client about what that means, right? And so when they brought us in, we were literally figuring out block forms with them. Kate, you want to talk a little bit more about this slide and some of what we're looking at?
Sure. So the owner owned the house that was on the lot, and they demoed it, but they wanted to keep the foundation. And so that's what you're seeing here, that the house is the same form factor as the previous house. And the longest facade, the one that we're seeing that's facing like plan southeast on this page, is facing directly south in reality. And that's great to get solar. The architect specifically designed the roof so that it would be really effective at capturing solar energy. However, that also means that a lot of the views were oriented south on that facade. And so this is a study that we did to show the impact of different overhang lengths and how we could get the radiation that we want on the roof without getting it in through those windows.
Absolutely. And what was great is just like in this early part of the design process with the architects, several members of the firm we were working with were just super interested in Passive House and have since gone on to like attend different Passive House conferences, and we have conversations regularly about it. We were also, because we were involved at this early stage, able to get a builder on board who is a fantastic Passive House builder. And, even in Austin, right, we kind of present as this progressive place full of, building science forward, but it's a huge market, and it's a market where there are a lot of builders and a lot of architects who haven't done this before. And so it is very much an emerging market, just like Fayetteville. And so having the confidence instilled, by having a great builder involved, having a consultant like us, doing this analysis early, actually allowed the project team to start thinking through what their baseline might be with confidence, right? Like if we do this, we're pretty confident that a builder can knock this out. And you guys have brought someone into the picture at this point that we think would be a great partner in it. And so, understanding with their aesthetic goals, how do we balance this out through the performance path for FIAS? So that they're in striking range. And that's really what we were playing around with a lot of this passive systems analysis. And as the form got more complete, we started looking at aspects of resiliency. And so as Kate was describing earlier, we're looking at solar, we're looking at batteries, we're looking at rainwater collection, and we're looking at how to make all of that make sense for the specific market that we're in. Okay, you want to talk a little bit about the way that we sized and placed the solar panels on this project?
Sure. So as you can see on the left, we offered the team 3 different options for where to place the solar panels. And the architect was really excited about putting the solar panels on the south-facing roof, but not so much about those other 2 options that we offered. But you can also see on this page that the south-facing solar panels are only offsetting 67% of the amount of energy per year that's being consumed by the house. And so that was an issue that they wanted to address. And so that was another opportunity for us to go back and look at the enclosure and say, okay, well, what are the levers we can pull to make the consumption less, to be more in line with the generation? And also this brings into play the conversation about outage preparedness. So because the house is solar limited, it doesn't make sense for the owner to shelter in place in the entire house. So what we recommended they do instead would be to shelter in place in the garage apartment, and then have some power walls to meet those needs there as well.
Absolutely. And what Kate's pointing at is, we went into a much deeper iterative process, which we can do with firms that have projects that are, higher budget. And it was such an educational experience for the architects and for us to learn how to work with architects in this way, who want kind of soup to nuts consulting. And it actually led to really fantastic outcomes in the engineering sense, because we were really well set up. We also commented on, we did the active systems with these folks as well, and kind of went through the spatial dimension kind of mechanical massing process with them. And it set us up really, really well for fluid engineering. We did mechanical, we did plumbing engineering on this. We did enclosure design, as you can see in the top left. The multicolored image in the middle is an isometric of our mechanical design that we did in Revit. The plan view of it in the top right is actually just the ventilation ducting that you can see. They were very excited about having a really nice ERV, which was a lot of fun. The image in the bottom left is actually it comes from a set that's a bit different than I think what a lot of commercial folks are used to when they think about electrical engineering. We actually provide what's called an electrical master plan. And rather than focusing on the engineering from the panel down to the plug loads, we're actually focusing on the site level infrastructure, from the service entrance, making sure that's sized correctly for the energy needs, through the renewable and backup systems to the panel, sizing it, and then making it such that there are panels or elements of the panel that can serve those islandable facilities that Kate was describing. So when they go to the guest house, right, the garage apartment, if there's another snowpocalypse in Austin, they know exactly how to make sure that that operates. If you haven't heard the term snowpocalypse yet, that is what everybody calls the event of last February here. It was a hellacious time for everyone in Austin, Texas, actually all over Texas. And then in the top left, you see just an enclosure detail. We worked with them a lot about actually getting into materials and specifying what the assemblies would look like. Did I leave anything out, Kate?
No, I think you did great.
Oh, one final note. I'm just looking at the notes here. In our plumbing engineering, it actually got to the point where they were concerned about overheating with hot water lines because the enclosure got to be so robust. So that was I think a really neat kind of educational moment. It made it visceral for the architecture firm. They're like, wow, we're actually having to think about hot water overheating this space, and that's pretty illustrative of how impactful enclosures can be, really thinking about them as batteries for thermal energy and experience. It's pretty wonderful. Okay, moving on. We're gonna talk about the third project. This was the hotel, hospitality / multifamily building in Galveston. Very unfamiliar with Passive House in the Galveston market. If you've never been to Galveston, it's a nice place to go. Texas beaches don't hold a candle to the East Coast, Florida, West Coast, but they're a lot of fun. And if you're careful, you won't get run over by a pickup truck when you go to them. So the context of this, I touched on it a little bit earlier, and Kate, help me remember if I forget something. But the owner was a developer funding this project himself. Was very excited about Passive House, wanted to create this educational opportunity for everyone who stays there, right? So there's actually going to be ways that they sort of guide their guests through the experience of what that space is. And that's really, I think, a lovely way to introduce folks to the Passive House concept and what it feels like to live in a space like that. It had some unique architectural programming. They had multiple spaces that were not necessarily residential or particularly hospitality or commercial. It was sort of a mix of all of them. So we had some navigating to do around code books and figuring out what all that meant. And the project, we got brought in actually after another consultant had already come in and kind of done a similar process to our passive systems analysis and was also doing enclosure consulting. So the big question for them was, okay, with a reasonable budget, maybe not going through this crazy robust engineering process with you guys, because that might break us for such a large footprint. And our enclosure already figured out, what can we be thinking about so that we avoid pitfalls? And what we were able to offer them was our active systems and our resilient systems consulting, which I think made a huge impact on their ability to bring this to a design build outfit actually on the island who could do it without a full engineered design. Did I leave anything off, Kate? Does that sound right?
Sounds good to me.
All right, cool. All right, so why don't you tell us what's going on here? What do we start doing when we're working through an active systems consulting process?
Sure. So what you're looking at on the left is a zoning diagram. And the main difference that we do kind of in active systems consulting versus in design engineering is that we look at the just the zones. We don't really get into a full like room by room load calculation. And the reason for that is that we're trying to get a general idea of how much equipment is needed, where it'll go, that sort of thing. We need to get like a number of ERVs, number of air handler units, but we don't need to fully figure out all of those things that you would in a manual J down the road. So the goal here is to be able to hand off sort of a basis of design to the engineer of record, who in this case was Energy Vanguard.
Yeah, absolutely. And thinking about block loads, it's a way to kind of get quick striking range tonnage data, right? What are we actually looking at here? And then internally at Positive Energy, we're thinking about like, okay, what do we know in terms of equipment lines makes sense for that. How do we actually help them, understand where that would go on the exterior of the building? What do the mechanical closets actually look like? What are the non-brand specific components that they're going to need? And what are the dimensionality of those? And not only just thinking about where the equipment can go, but making sure that there's space for installability, serviceability, this kind of thing. So in a way, through this mechanical programming process, we're describing to the team, what a mechanical core pod could look like. And then they can then build that into their own model and start to figure out where it might make sense. We also comment on distribution. So, my slide didn't change. There we go. We comment on distribution and not necessarily duct sizing for them, but talking about kind of what the max size duct clearance they would need through structure, how to think reasonably about, because often it will run into situations where someone has provided space for mechanicals, but structurally it's impossible to get out of that space. And so how do you actually serve what you need to in the building with ductwork that can't move anywhere? So just kind of thinking through these things when the model is very fluid is a huge way to move the needle towards something that's very installable, that's very buildable. And it's also a really great way for architecture firms to start to internalize how big these systems are. I think a lot of times it's guesswork, and sometimes it's great guesswork. Sometimes it's based on previous experience, but getting, quantitative feedback on these things with engineering oversight without diving into the full financial commitment, especially on like a residential project, for a really robust Revit model and engineering process. They get the data they need, and then this is something that a design build outfit could take off with, or we kind of treat it like here's a schematic level mechanical concept and then hand it off, like Kate mentioned, to an engineer of record to actually go through. And we've done it both ways. It's a lot of fun to kind of play with that both ways. Okay, so resiliency. Kate, let's talk about what their goals were and kind of what we were able to achieve and accomplish with them.
So this project being on Galveston Island is really familiar with hurricanes. And so they wanted to make this location a place of refuge that the guests could feel comfortable at in the event of power outage, water loss, all of those things that come along with a hurricane. And so we tested out a few different options for the solar array, and this is one you're seeing that's 55 kilowatts on the bottom left. And then we also looked at some rainwater collection options, and so we ended up recommending that they go with 2 tanks, and so that's what you're seeing on the right.
Absolutely. And what's really lovely about this concept is that the owner, he's really thinking about the community and contexts in which this is placed, even though it's a hospitality project that's aimed at tourists for the most part. Like he wants food trucks nearby. He wants like this full sumptuous experience that actually adds to the neighborhood that he's building in. That is a source of pride for the community, because it is a place of refuge both for guests and for neighbors in situations where it's called for. And showing that he can really do something that is sustainable and not just another sort of slap together rental house that a family is going to rent for a week at a time, leaving the locals to kind of deal with the fallout, when there is a hurricane or serious storm. So we were very, very impressed with this. He also was so thrilled about kind of the process that we went through together that he used it he was one of the case study speakers at the Humid Climate Conference. And if you're not familiar with the Humid Climate Conference, it was a Trojan horse strategy to convince the good folks in the architecture, engineering, and construction world in Austin, Texas, that Passive House was a totally viable thing. When Katrin came to Austin the first time to present on Passive House, people, and it was actually pre-2015, right? So the climate zone specific standard hadn't been out yet, but was met with so much resistance. And it was just like silly how much resistance was there. And it was not based in fact, it was based on sort of gut reaction to this. Everyone's scared of change, and that's totally understandable. So we looked at like, how do we not dive into the shame and blame game? How do we actually try and show people how close they are, right? It follows the exact same logic. And so what we did is we said, we're going to have a building science conference, because that seemed to be a trendy word that everybody can get behind. And we're talking about the same things. So what we did is we had this building science conference, got great speakers, and then wove in a lot of passive house stuff. And then we did this every 2 years, and we've sold it out every single time. And it's been amazing. Like from when we started it 8 years ago to now, how many people, like how the conversations have changed around passive house in Austin, and more broadly in the hot, humid climates in the United States, and even internationally. So that's been really, really wonderful. It's also been a huge vehicle for FIAS to get a lot of feedback on the heating and cooling targets and such for hot, humid climates, because we're connecting so many different passive house projects with them. And the owner of this project was absolutely in the same vein. He wanted people to know about what he's up to, and actually presented at this conference as a case study for a passive house project that, you know, is not strictly a multifamily, not strictly hospitality. It's sort of this in-between thing, and showing that, you know, weird stuff's also totally doable in the passive house world. And that was really exciting. And so to kind of summarize, you know, we at Positive Energy, we love to dangle carrots. Like that's our big thing. You know, even for projects that have a tremendous window to wall ratio, walking someone through the process of understanding the impacts of that and what the trade-offs are is so much more powerful than just telling them they're wrong, telling them that this isn't something you should do. And it allows people to kind of arrive at those conclusions on their own, and with informed data at the back of the decision-making matrix. And it's part of the reason that I really love working at Positive Energy. I wake up and I feel like great about my day, because it's, even on a tough day, you know, I get to talk to people who are actually trying to move the needle in the right direction. And that's a really, really fun thing to do. It means a lot to me. I don't know what I would do if I didn't work at Positive Energy. I'd probably, I don't know, maybe I'll go be a stage carpenter again in San Francisco, or a monk or something like that. But it's you know, making real this McLeamy curve, like actually trying to figure out what that looks like from a business sense, was not an easy thing to do, but it's something that we have really stuck it out through. And Kate can attest to this too. Like when we started workshopping these services, we've been doing them for about 3 years now. They have come so far and are so different than they started. And all of it was based on just sort of like, after a project was over, what did we learn from that? How does that impact our contract? How does that impact our process? How did that impact the project outcomes? Like really thinking through all of this. How can we make this more accessible? Does it need to change shape? It's a scary place to be, kind of from that entrepreneurial perspective. Like you don't know how this is going to go. You're sort of throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing if it's done. But then project after project after project, and seeing this grow is just so encouraging, because it really shows that this has legs. Like this approach makes a lot of sense, and it's not unique to what Positive Energy can do only. Everybody can take this approach, and we want everybody to take this approach. And we look at this as sort of walking in parallel with a lot of other really great thinkers in the market. You know, we do things a way that we do, and we think that that works really well for our particular business model, but we also see plenty of other people doing things in different ways, and that suits your business model, your market. We want to hear from you guys, frankly, hopefully in the Q&A session in a little bit, kind of not only questions that you have, but about what you've seen. We want to hear, those of you in emerging passive house markets, what has been your experience? What's worked well? What hasn't? Spaces like this are so important to share that kind of stuff. And I've been going on for a little bit, so I'm going to let Kate talk.
Yeah, I really like my job too. And I think the coolest thing that I get to see out of a collaboration is when an architect becomes an advocate for high performance and what we're doing. As Miguel mentioned, we don't always get to work on passive house projects. And this one that you're seeing on the screen does have a lot of glass, but we got them to extend their overhangs about 4 feet longer than they would have if they hadn't talked to us. So it's little things like that that get me really excited about what we get to do. And yeah, I'll hand it back to Miguel.
I love it. In Kate's describing the ripple effect that happens, right? It's like this isn't just a project specific lesson that was learned. This becomes part of their firm culture, part of their design philosophy and their understanding of the climate that they're designing for. And we have the unique privilege to work in climate zones all over the country, not just in hot and humid Austin, Texas. So, bringing lessons to bear, thinking about climate specific design strategies is so powerful. And getting to do that, I just feel like the luckiest person in the world. It's really awesome. And it's weird to have come to this from being an archaeologist, digging around in the dirt. But you'd be amazed at the parallels. There's so much we can learn about how societies have really pivoted and changed their practices, based on the artifacts that we leave behind. And ultimately, that's what we're doing with these buildings. Is like, how long are they going to last? Is somebody going to find them, long after we're gone? I hope so. If we do it right, maybe we won't be long gone. We'll have built this lovely, sustainable place for everybody to thrive in. And that's if you want to learn more about us, learn more about how we relate to buildings, we believe that they should be places where people can thrive. And that means everybody engaged in the design and construction process, people living in them, the people that are impacted by them. Look us up on the web. We're everywhere. That's our handle on Twitter and Instagram. Check out our website. And then for those of you that don't know, I am woefully behind on editing episodes, like probably a year behind, and I apologize, but Kate's had me very, very busy trying to bring new work in. We have a podcast, and this is a podcast that Christoph and I started about 7 years ago. And we wanted to get out of the mode of thinking about building science through the lens of just kind of enclosure. And we wanted to look more broadly at the adjacent scientific disciplines that impact the building industry, and then kind of tie them into our understanding. So it's a lot of this kind of synthesis work that doesn't have hard boundaries. We interview a lot of really great experts. When you start listening, you'd be like, how the hell does this apply to building science? And then by the end, you're like, oh, wow, yeah, we should be thinking about that. And it's just such a joy to work on. It's a labor of love. I wish we made money on it, but we don't. So it's one of those things that gets the back burner till I can get to it. And I promise, I will edit episodes very soon. I have some bandwidth, hopefully, on my horizon to do that. And that's all that we have for now. I'm going to drink some water and then kick it back to the host to talk about what happens next.